Hey guys, Pablo back with Meditation Amsterdam, and in today's video we're gonna go once again into the book that we've been quote mining for the past few videos, which is The Hero's Journey, based on conversations with the mythicist Joseph Campbell. And during last video we explored this idea of whether Jesus and the Buddha are the same thing, or rather the Christ and the Buddha are the same thing. Jesus and the Buddha are not the same thing. And we concluded that according to this mythicist view, the answer is yes, because the Christ and the Buddha are not persons, but levels of consciousness that we could all strive to achieve. And today I want to expand on that theme because I think it's very, very important, and it builds on this idea that contrary to what we think in Western culture, and contrary to what we intuitively think when our consciousness level is low, that is when we haven't begun doing meditation and other practices, which is that it is the individual that matters. What is being proposed here is that it's consciousness in general that matters, and consciousness manifests in different individuals, okay? So to illustrate that, there's a little story that Joseph Campbell takes us through, and I'm going to read that to you, and then we can get into it. But it's going to become, I hope, for the viewer very obvious of what it is that we're trying to say here. So the story goes like this. So Daisetsu Suzuki, the Zen philosopher, brought up this story doing one of his Zen talks. And he talks of a young man who asks his Zen master, "Am I in possession of Buddha consciousness?" And the guru says, "No." The young man says, "Well, I heard that all things are in possession of Buddha consciousness. The stones, the trees, the flowers, the birds, the animals, and all beings." "Yes," said the master, "you are correct. All things are in possession of Buddha consciousness. The stones, the flower, the bees, the birds, but not you." "Why not me?" "Because you're asking the question." Okay, and I'm going to read you, rather than tell you my explanation, I'm going to read you the explanation of Joseph Campbell. He says, "That is to say, instead of living in the knowledge of himself from that transcendent source, he is living in the knowledge of himself as a separate unit, and that throws him off. So he isn't living in Buddha consciousness." In other words, the part of the brain, or the logic and the place from which he's coming when he asks, "Do I have it?" is the thing that makes him not have it, right? Because that is an egoic concern, if that makes any sense. So when you're it, you don't have to ask the question anymore. And that's the entire lesson here. It's that it is a question. If you remember, we talked a few videos ago about this field that dispenses with notions of right and wrong, and that was from Rumi, the Sufi poet. He says there is a field where notions of right or wrong don't matter and don't exist, and I want to meet you there. And once again, it comes back here, and this is a really, really important theme. This is what it's all about. It's that so long as you are concerned for the little me, the self as which you perceive yourself to be, which is separate from everything else, "Do I have it or not?" means you are concerned with an egoic question and with the separate self, and therefore the answer is no, right? And so so he says, now the trick for the artist is to present his material so that it doesn't put a ring around itself and stand there as a separate from you, the observer. And so what it means is, again, now he's talking about art. A lot of what he did actually was advise artists on how to develop and how to let that bigger self flow through them, as opposed to being concerned with, am I making the coolest art, or will I be the most important artist in the world, or those kind of things. Again, the same logic coming back that keeps you away from Buddha consciousness, and instead to just let that flow through them, so that and he mentions that in a different passage in this book. He says great art is never personal, right? It stands for something greater than the person who's creating it. And so here's another book, another quote. Buddha consciousness is the one consciousness of which we are all manifestations, right? We are all separate manifestations of this great consciousness that informs the whole universe. The plants are conscious, the stones are conscious, all things are conscious. And then he illustrates that with a very important analogy. And he says, so when one light breaks, this is a kind of an explanation. When one light breaks, the superintendent of buildings and grounds doesn't come and say, oh, I was particularly fond of that bulb. That was the important one. This is a calamity. He simply takes out the burnt bulb and puts another one in. Why? Because what's important is the light. So what's important is the light and not the vehicle. And so he says, just as all bulbs are vehicles for the light, which is what matters, all people and all beings and all things are vehicles for consciousness, which is what matters. And that is a kind of very philosophical Eastern way to say that we matter far much less as individuals than our head tells us that we do. And the same goes for our relatives, our pets, and all these kind of things. They start to matter to us when we see them from the smaller self or the ego that identifies with them. In other words, so that's essentially the idea. Now, then you could start to say, well, that's kind of a sociopathic view of the world where I don't matter and you don't matter and your relatives don't matter, and therefore, you have this kind of grim view of the world. But that's kind of a caricature of the point, right? You of course attach to things in a healthy way, but there has to be an underlying understanding that's living the human experience on one level, but you can also rise to another level at which, while that human experience is running and with all its ups and downs, there's a certain basic, a more fundamental understanding that comes about also as you meditate, which is beyond that in a sense. And perhaps I could illustrate that through one of the experiences that I had during my Vipassana retreat at the start of this year, in which after something like 11 hours of meditation per day, which was very intense, you start to feel very clearly that external events have no power, hold no power over you, that you can cut through them with this knife of awareness that just dispenses with anything that comes at you, because you are seeing things very, very clearly. Instead of creating right and wrong stories about, oh, this happens, this is bad, this happens, this is good, you simply observe things super clearly, exactly as they are and as they come. And that is the moment at which stories and judgments of right and wrong start to give way to pure, clear awareness, which is, in a sense, not even above that. It's just a completely different space of mind in which you can inhabit. So there you have it. So this is yet another passage from Joseph Campbell's book, which I think that first of all illustrates a very important point, and also comes to show that Joseph and all his mythicist background and studies were not particularly Western, actually. So he knew all about mythology, of course, but a lot of what he talked about was about Eastern concepts and Eastern ways of thinking. And he was friends with Alan Watts, for example, which was a Zen philosopher. And so I'll leave you with that idea in the spirit of doing these short clips that I said I would start putting out there. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll be coming back next time with yet another and perhaps the last quote that I will mine from The Hero's Journey before we move on to a different book. And I'll try to come back with that one pretty soon after this. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it helps you start to wrap your head around what we mean when we say that it's not about the individual and the small self. What it means when Zen masters answer with these sort of very mysterious questions, what they're trying to do is they're trying to disconnect you from the part of the brain that is triggering those questions, which is the little me, the one that worries about do I have it or not, and all those kind of things. And once again, what this Zen master said is, well, you don't have it because you're asking the question. And it's not so much the question itself, but the place from which it's coming that shows that you are not yet embodying Buddha consciousness. So I hope that, that gives you a bit of an idea of what this whole thing is about, and also the kind of space of mind that you can start to cultivate as you practice meditation of several kinds. And well, I'll leave you to it, and that'll be it for today. Cheers.